We want this to be as informative as possible for you, so even though they have formal presentations, they're open to question during the presentation if questions arise.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Tell me what you want to do.
Sure. So, thank you, Rebecca and Aaron, for inviting me to ask me to come here and share some ideas, and of course, thank you all for being here. It is really always exciting to be able to engage more closely with the members of the community. Some of you actually have seen some of the DJPC events. Perhaps I haven't met you formally, but so you can see some of the faces of people being engaged in important issues such as this. So this is the gentleman we're trying to make sense of today, right? The Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil. If there's one thing about that may perhaps silver lining in this whole process is that for the wrong reasons, I mean, Brazil has been more talked about, right? People are paying more attention. There's more news about Brazil coming out, and we're really trying to make sense of this. So Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, came to power, as you all know, and this is been shared in the news, even in this country, repeatedly in the last several months. It was elected last October in Brazil as president in the second round of elections at October 28th. And he really came to power representing a widespread and very, aggressive, vitriolic, conservative reaction and broad conservative coalition of forces in Brazil, ending what until a few years before, until about 2016, had been a rule of the Labour Party, broad coalition of forces in Brazil, and a lot of different changes, more progressive changes taking place in the country in the first, broadly 15 years of the century. I want to highlight that Bolsonaro, until recently, until a few years ago, had been always this exotic member of the chamber in Congress in Brazil. This outrageous, eccentric person that always made this wild claims that the dictatorship of Brazil in the 1960s and 70s had not killed enough people, and it should have been even more violent. But in addition to some of those eccentric right-wing claims, he wasn't really taken very seriously, and on his voting record, he was a much more sort of traditional military conservative positions, such as defending statist control of the economy as long as it was in the hands of the military, such as was the case in the dictatorship in the 70s. So, he really had to reinvent himself in the last couple years, or basically last year, to really be now the leader of a yes, conservative right-wing and has a military side to it, but a much broader conservative coalition that also revived neoliberal forces in Brazil. So that's kind of what he really represents. He represents this more of a means to come to power of this broad coalition of forces, rather than he himself being, the sponsor and the organizer of this coalition. Yes.
When was he elected? When did he take office?
He was elected in October last year, and he took office on January 1st this year.
This year.
Yes. So in this coalition, he has members of the military supporting him. He is also supported by the conservative business groups, the business and economic elites in the country. Along with that, some ideologues on the neoliberal forces, the people really claiming to be reviving neoliberal positions in Brazil. Conservative middle classes, which, especially in the last few years in Brazil, are basically representing largely the middle classes, especially in the more urban and industrial centers of the country, in the south and south center of Brazil. And very importantly, which in my view, and I think many people would have been saying this, a large support among urban poor in the suburban areas of the main urban centers in the south and center-south of Brazil, especially among the evangelical, neo-Pentecostal voters in those cities. So again, this represents a reaction to important social policies that were reducing extreme poverty in Brazil. So there are important economic changes. I don't know if you could just kind of click on the next chart, just to briefly to revive some notes on the reduction of poverty in Brazil that was taking place in the first 10, 15 years of this century. And then in addition to economic policies, there were also changes insofar as affirmative action policies, racial-related, race-related inequalities, mild. I mean, I think in many ways, the Labour Party, Lula's, broad coalition, was a reformist coalition by all means. It could not really be called any sort of radical leftist movement. But it started to be portrayed as such in the last few years in Brazil by the media, by conservative ruling groups, business groups, and among middle classes, and really, created this, what later coalesced into a broad reaction against these policies, coming, eventually resulting in Bolsonaro's election in Brazil. This movement started in 2015, 16, largely among middle classes in Brazil, in the big urban centers. I just want to highlight a picture of sort of one of those demonstrations that took place in the main financial center of the country in São Paulo. You can see there, people celebrating, middle class people, white members of the Brazilian society, with champagne toasts, and basically what they're claiming, that's what he says on this image here, is, I want my country back. You might have seen that before. And so there were a lot of echoes and similarities with similar trends taking place elsewhere in the country. But in the last couple of years, starting here, this is probably in 2016, maybe in 2015, but more recently, the last year and a half, this support really widened and started incorporating important segments of not necessarily white Brazilians, mestizo Brazilians, Afro-descendants, and especially low middle class or even lower class people living in the suburban areas of the main cities in Brazil, such as São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte, Porto Alegre, some of the main urban places, where he was able really to make the case for why he should be elected to give an end to the Labour Party rule in the country. Again, the evangelical vote was decisive in many ways, but in addition to that, it really was an anti-establishment vote. And I think that's also echoing dynamics taking place in this country and other parts of the world, Brexit and other parts, right? This anti-establishment vote, anti-everything which is here, that we need to actually raise and start from scratch, an anti-institutional, anti-political system, anti-current political parties, with a important conservative moral agenda, and that really was a sort of the glue that brought it together with the evangelical vote in the urban centers, with the traditional conservative, but not necessarily cultural or morally conservative, but economically neoliberal, pro-market, anti-social policies, views of the urban middle classes in the country, and business groups. So I just want to highlight once again the evangelical vote, and I just have a picture of one of these mega churches in Brazil, the Pentecostal churches in Brazil, which is it's somewhat of a recent phenomenon in the last 30 years, 40 years in Brazil. So this is one of the main churches in Brazil, which is a very powerful Brazilian made in Brazil, neo-Pentecostal church. It's called actually it used to have a branch right on Colorado Avenue, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. They own the second main TV channel in the country now, and several radio stations, and they control a significant portion of the vote in Congress by electing people in different political parties and be able to really rein them in to very conservative political agenda. So in many ways, Bolsonaro represented this anti-vote, but with this tones of a moral agenda, inclusive policies, and tied to also economic, conservative, or neoliberal, right? In the Latin American context, liberal, neoliberal policies, pro-market policies. Which in many ways, it opens the possibility for us to really be paying attention on how they're going to be able to maintain and sustain this broad coalition. It is in many ways maybe it's too strong a word, but a Frankenstein-like coalition with very different segments, and hard to really keep it together. The government has seen a lot of problems in being able to have a coherent position in Congress and even in the media, a lot of back and forth between different people in the government saying different things and having to backtrack, and the president having to correct them. Sometimes the president being corrected by the vice president or by other members of the cabinet. So it's facing a lot of problems. However, much damage has already been done, and that's really what I wanted to talk a little more about. Seeing highlighted the things that we already see as problems, on the horizon, and also get to the point that I really want us to really focus more was the possibility for resistance here. So I just want to, and you might need to actually stay there, because I'll be going through several slides. So one of the areas where we see a lot of problems already is in the, well, one of the environmental policies, right? The deforestation and attacks on the Amazon, but also along with that, indigenous communities. So those are two of the main areas where the government, despite all the contradictions and problems that it has faced, it has been pretty sustained course of attacking indigenous rights. Bolsonaro, already before becoming a presidential candidate, but especially during the campaign, really went after saying, the native Brazilians have too much land, there's too few of them, we need to really revert this, and if it was up to me, they should have no land at all. Right? Which is a constitutional established provision, but he wants to revisit those. We're taking this important effort in Congress, but they're working on that. And tied to it, of course, the problem of attacks on environmental conservation, which as you can see here, this is indigenous territory, and on the side is the agribusiness community. One of the first things he did on the first week in office was to transfer the management of indigenous territory to the Ministry of Agriculture, which is in the hands of agribusiness. And you can really see the conflict of interest, the spread conflict of interest right there. And another area where it has been very vocal, and it really speaks to two areas, right? It speaks to the glue on his coalition, which is this conservative moral agenda, cultural agenda, is LGBT rights. He has reverted back on some of the few, legal guarantees and protections that those communities have had in the country, and attacking actually the human rights agenda that has, progressive in a moderate course being unfolded in the previous, not only 15 but even 20, 25 years before attacked. LGBT rights, we have the Minister of Human Rights and Family, which is a new name of the same position in the cabinet, which is this lady here, Damares, who is an evangelical pastor, and she's been known now. She's saying here that feminism feminism here is something that ugly women that hate men defend. That is she didn't come up with that statement. It's something that you hear in Brazilian, very traditional macho machista views, and she's just voicing that again. And she made it her own by saying that we need to stop this entire cultural agenda, and from now on, boys need to wear blue and girls need to wear pink. And from now on, this is how the country is going to go. Of course, there was some backlash even among middle classes that support the government, because they are a little more open-minded to say that that's absurd. We're not going to go back on those things, but they're pushing that agenda sometimes. Basically to blur the view of what really is being advanced in Congress, such as the anti-environmental and economic policies, but nonetheless, right, it's something that we need to pay attention. In addition to that, and really is a little more concerning because it also speaks to institutional problems that go beyond the coalition in power today, members of the federal ministry, public ministry, are coming out segments among them, very, very conservative views, and there's a picture of a group of them which are really saying that we need to revisit this whole conversation about human rights, because human rights need to be only applicable to righteous humans. You can really see the plain words there, saying that human rights for all is absurd, should not be universal notion of human rights, such as, of course, criminals should have no human rights, and they need to be treated as such, and so forth and so on. And these are the people that are, hired to defend the human rights law, legislation, and are really trying to also be part of this conversation and a moralistic, conservative cultural agenda. There has also been seen already some erosion in achievements in education, which was one of the important areas that, especially already previous to Lula's government during Cardoso, especially during Lula, in higher education and a significant enlargement in accessibility to higher education has been promoted, and we have, so that will be the next one, would be this. So the actual Minister of Education was fired last week and replaced by a person really aligned with similar views, but that one character has, no longer was viable because he had said too many stupid things such as this one. He asked all children in the country to start singing the national anthem every morning, which was something that was done in the dictatorship. When I grew up, I used to do that. And they should be proud and should actually put some slogans of the presidential campaign of Bolsonaro and record themselves repeating those things in videos and send it to say, how proud we are to be Brazilians and how proud we are to be members of this new Brazil that is being built. Of course, there was a significant backlash, even in the media, which is otherwise very supportive of the government, and eventually this person was fired, no longer viable, but replaced by someone who's really attacking this accessibility to higher education and attacking affirmative action policy that we put in place in the years past. And so we see with the tremendous concern what's happening there, let alone the problems of funding. They're really, reverting funds to education in general. I mean, in terms of social programs, they're reverting funds, which already was put in place previous to Bolsonaro's ascension to power, but now is being pushed even further, right, to make it impossible to really allocate funds to social programs, education, health, and these kind of things. In addition to that, an important segment which was a cabinet member that was important to make viable the campaign of Bolsonaro, who is this judge, which you might have heard about, Moro. Judge Moro, who is this guy who actually is responsible for going after the Labour Party, basically targeting the Labour Party in his corruption investigations, and is the one responsible for sentencing Lula to prison, and Lula now is serving a 15-year sentence in prison. It was 12 and a half and was pushed to maybe 25. Maybe
25 total because it's 2.
Yeah, it was even expanded. And this is Judge Moro, which is that gentleman right over there, which is kind of the guy who tries to validate Bolsonaro as someone that represents institutional policies, but he really is pushing for a mano dura, right? It's this really militaristic stance on not just on crime, but on law, on application of law in general, right? And they try to really change the law to make it much easier for policemen to kill, people on the streets and never be tried, never be punished. I mean, in many ways, they already do that in a practical sense, but now they're going to make it legal, right? Legitimate by law, that kind of approach to things. In addition to that, we've seen a lot of derailments in the foreign policy, which was one of the main things that Lula became known for globally, right? The stature of Brazil became much more visible and respected worldwide. We had the foreign minister of Lula here a couple years ago at Corbel, right? Celso Amorim, and he was just, even got a mention as what was called the best foreign minister in the world a few years ago by Foreign Affairs magazine, right? So really put Brazil on the map in many ways. We can revisit if that was worthy or not, but it's really been derailed in many ways by someone who even conservative forces in Brazil consider to be a phony foreign minister. It's someone who really shouldn't be there, has no idea what he's doing, but really is instrumental, is useful to Bolsonaro in this basically destructive view of the institutions and changing everything from basically to scratch. And then the most important cabinet member in Brazil, which is this gentleman right there on this side of Bolsonaro, Paulo Guedes, the neoliberal ideologue, someone who praises not only the Chicago boys in Chile, but praises the dictatorship in Chile, who was taught in Chile during the dictatorship, the final years of the dictatorship, but is very, very proud to having done so, and really wants to push a similar agenda, overt, extreme neoliberal policies in Brazil, and who now is really working with the support that Bolsonaro has in Congress to pass a series of laws and legislation, one of them really basically ending Social Security as Brazil knows it, which it plays a decisive role in the life of the poor, not only similar to what was the history of Social Security implementation in this country, but even beyond that. It has a social safety net role that goes beyond the specific notion of retirement, because it attacks people with disabilities, and it meets needs for people with disability, people with extreme poverty, and he basically wants to privatize that entire system. And it will really deepen inequality in Brazil to unprecedented levels. In addition to that, we have seen a tremendous level of militarization of the government. We now, no one really knows for sure, but it's estimated about 100 active military men serve in the government today by leading specific positions in the cabinet and presidential staff. All but one position is in the hands of the military. Bolsonaro is a former military man, but of course now he's a civilian. But only one in the presidential staff in the palace, right, cabinet members is a civilian, who's Onyx Lorenzoni. But all the other ones are military men, and they had in different agencies and branches of the government in the hands of about 100 generals or coroners. Some of them retired, but many of them in active service still. There's a militarization of other things in Brazil, such as schools. This is a picture of a school, of a high school in Brasilia, a civilian high school, right? But which now is being sort of existing under a military style, right, order and discipline logic to things. In addition to that, we've seen a paramilitary role growing in government institutions. There's serious, not only allegation, I would say evidence of the Bolsonaro family's involvement into paramilitary groups in the city of Rio, including behind the assassination of Marielle Franco, right, the councilwoman that we're going to have a picture of her later on to sort of remind us of her importance. And so now, what to do? What's some sort of possibilities for resistance in this, which is something that Rebecca rightly asked me to touch upon. Of course, this is a process, this is in the works, this is what we're all trying to do. I am a little more optimistic today than 2 months ago in some ways. For once, because I think the government is a little more dysfunctional than it could be, like that was expected. That's good for us. Though, it could get its act together, at some point. But I think artists, right, and the same role they played historically in Brazilian society, historically in Latin American societies, and especially in the dictatorship, they may again rise, not all of them, but important members in the artistic community to be a voice of, common sense and reason, but right, which now is becoming, of course, a scarce commodity. And so this is Wagner Moura, this gentleman right over here, in promoting his movie, which is about a guerrilla member in the 60s in Brazil, which was murdered by the military dictatorship, and he's holding Marielle Franco's name of a street plaque, which was destroyed during the Bolsonaro campaign, and that's why, not the same one, of course, but the emblem, right, of a resistance now is to carry this plaque of the street name of Marielle Franco, which was named after her murder, of course. Some people point that the media perhaps could be a means of promoting resistance. I am a little more doubtful of that, because I think actually the media in Brazil is very, very much in the hands of a few families, very powerful families. It's very oligopolized. One important segment is in the hands of the evangelical church, which is behind Bolsonaro's election, and even the other families and groups in the main newspapers and TV channels they may threaten to denounce and to make some, accusations of the government in order to obtain some concessions and favor some government, but they're not going to play the decisive role to be critical of them. In Congress, perhaps, not because there will be concerted resistance, because opposition is a minority, but because they cannot get their act together. They have too many parties in support, but it's an ad hoc support that has to be negotiated, almost every day, every week. So we may see some things there, not necessarily to revert the agenda, but to water down some of the reforms that are being pushed, such as the social security policies being pushed now. In social segments and in traditional, sectors of unions, they haven't really shown that they'll be able to do much yet. And I don't say that lightly, I say that with tremendous pain, because I think they're tremendously weak and under serious attack now. They may rise to be able to work together more and be able to provide more organized and sort of levels of resistance, but it's something to be seen. So in the end, I just want to close with a couple images, which is one is we count a lot on international solidarity, such as this one, such as what we're doing here, right? And there is this organization, now they changed the name, it's called US Network for Democracy in Brazil, but I don't have their new logo. But it's basically the same idea, right? You can find them up online. There's a lot of academics involved, and that's how I came to be involved in this. Aaron is involved. But also goes beyond that to activists, largely among Brazilians in the United States, but also, of course, US citizens and people in general that are just concerned about the level and the quality of democracy in Brazil. So that's one thing. And we do have a sort of a group in Denver that we do some events, such as one event. This was part of what we planned to do a month ago, and we're still counting as an event, of this group. And I just want to highlight, especially when we were to meet when we had the blizzard, right? It was on the 1-year anniversary of the murder of Marielle Franco, and I want to end again with an image of her, this tremendous woman. If you don't know about her, please look her up. She is really a fascinating, political figure that I'll be the first to confess, didn't know much about her until her tragic murder, but once I heard about it, looked more, and I was amazed how, what a woman, what a powerful person, and an amazing figure that she was. And we need to carry on her legacy, and first thing to remember her, and also to continue her fight for promotion of social inclusion and social justice and democracy in Brazil, which is what we'll be talking about today. So once again, I thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'll be happy to, of course, I'll stay around and have to talk more about with you. So for now, I'll just let Mark take over.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be talking and being part of this conversation and promote Untitled Justice and Peace. I'm trying to be brief and allow more time for our discussion. Basically, Rafael covered all of the main aspects of the situation in Brazil right now. I will try to add a couple of observations regarding both the prospects of Bolsonaro government and the prospects of this resistance from the civil society and social movements. Today is the third anniversary of President Dilma Rousseff impeachment.
Wow.
And it is 1 year after the imprisonment of former President Lula, and also one year and 1 month of the assassination of Marielle Franco. So there's plenty to be pessimistic about the situation in Brazil right now, and we are actually in doubt if the confusions and infighting and frailties of the Bolsonaro government is actually something to be more worried about than be happy about. Because as Rafael mentioned, there are the strongest base of this government is the armed forces, the army folks. And by the Brazilian law, if this government collapses and President Bolsonaro resigns, for example, it would not be the first time in Brazilian history. By the constitution, they have to call for new elections. And there's no way the military will allow new elections where the Workers' Party would win and they actually party has a good chance to win any new elections. So the situation can get even worse if this government collapses. I will show you just to reinforce some points made by Rafael. This is a picture of Brazil, and as you can see in the northeast part, the Workers' Party and the center left is still strong. And most of the southeast and south parts and the center west part of Brazil were supportive of Bolsonaro. And Brazil is a very, very unequal society. And this voting, since the beginning of 20th century, became even more divided by social class and public values. So. In poorer areas of the country, either big cities or in remote areas, they tended to vote more for the Workers' Party. And in the richest parts of the country, they tended to vote more to Bolsonaro. And the same goes for the evangelical and Catholic vote. The Catholics tended to vote more for the Workers' Party, and the evangelicals and Pentecostals tended to vote more for Bolsonaro. So it's a very divided situation in Brazil. But because of our political system, the way it works, it prevents a single candidate, a single political force to have a strong majority of let's say, 2/3 of the Congress or 2/3 of the state governments or local governments or in any way. The society is very divided, and we have a more elite that concentrates almost 80% of the Brazilian wealth and 73% of the Brazilian income. And we have a vast majority of people that is in between, and poverty is reduced, mainly during the Workers' Party movement, but it's still a significant divide, and of course, the political system prevents Bolsonaro to get this elite and to get this vote from the middle classes and from some of the urban poor, translated into political capacity to change the laws and the constitution. So this is very technical, but the thing is we have nowadays in Brazil 35 political parties, and 30 of them got seats in the Brazilian Congress, and 22 of them got seats in the Senate. And governors in the states are also too fragmented. We do have more than 13 different political parties controlling different states. Workers' Party is the one that won more governorships, and the Workers' Party controls four state governments. So there is a very fragmented situation, and the infighting in the Bolsonaro's coalition is very worrisome in the sense that it may collapse, but it may get their act together and be successful, which is even worse due to the political agenda they are promoting. The situation in the country now is pretty much what in the government, I mean, is pretty much well described by Rafael. I only would like to add that after 100 days, because this is another date that's important, there's 100 days, or a little bit more than 100 days, that Governor Bolsonaro is in office. And so far they were able to push some of regressive decisions and attacks to environment, human rights, and in foreign policy areas. And they are trying to implement some very destructive new laws in Congress, especially the pension reform. But in general, they have been governing without any strong social resistance and opposition so far. This is what is changing now. After 100 days and so much infighting and political instability, the institutional crisis is growing. And as they progress in trying to implement the social regressive, anti-liberal, anti-democratic agenda, more social forces, and including part of the Bolsonaro electorate, are realizing that this government is against their own interests and basic moral sentiments. And the support to Bolsonaro in the big cities is dropping dramatically. Nowadays, only 32% overall of the people that are interviewed say his government is good or great. 30% already said that it's bad or terrible, and 1/3 says this is regular. So it's a huge drop in public support, and it's even bigger in the big cities where most of the Brazilian population is concentrated now. But we are characterized by a very low mobility society. We are not just very unequal, one of the most unequal countries in the world, but social mobility is very limited in Brazil. And I don't think people will be passively accepting the destruction of a few educational opportunities that were open to gain some social mobility in the previous government. So This is maybe changed in a couple of months. And the real challenge is how to move to a more strong opposition and also a sort of resistance from inside and counting with foreign and global solidarity regarding the situation in Brazil without risking a military coup that could end democracy for good in Brazil for another cycle of a couple of years. This is the problem, and just to give an example of what Rafael was saying regarding Lulo's agenda, the harsh punishment and the mano dura approach to deal with not only crime and corruption, but social dissidents, social divergence, and political opposing. There's a march of the Amazon Indians in Brasilia to protest and to affirm the indigenous rights this week. And the government authorized the use of deadly force against the Indians for the next 30 days, using the National Guard to repress them. So there is a disposition from this government to, as long as social resistance began to rise up again, to double the bet and repress them. That's the main problem. And why will be inevitably, I think, more social resistance and political opposition, and that's why the national solidarity is so important right now. Because not only this agenda is very regressive and offensive to basic moral and self-interest of the poor in Brazil and middle classes even, but it's failing to deliver its promises. Basically, the message was, we are going to get rid of your social rights and your human rights, and the trade-off will be more economic growth. So you will have less rights but more jobs, similar to the kind of conservative or neo-conservative agenda in the United States. But the thing is, because of the recession, economic growth not only is not happening, we are expecting weaker growth compared to Latin America and the world this year, but also the number of unemployed is growing. From the time Bolsonaro was elected to now, we do have 1 more million unemployed, and we have 12.4% of our workforce unemployed now. But what is even worse, the concept of working age population is underutilized. I mean, people that are not studying, not working, or not working in a regular job, or giving up of looking for a job. These are almost 25% of the Brazilian population in working age now. So, if this government continues to destroy social rights, to attack human rights, and to attack environmental and economic development in the country, I think it will be inevitable that the most affected by documents will react at some point. In the foreign affairs aspect, as Rafael mentioned as well, this government is based on supporting Trump's policies and regime change in Venezuela, and something that the military were refusing a couple of weeks ago, which was to participate in a military action against the Chavista regime in Venezuela, now is on the table again. So Brazil just got out of the migration pact UN Migration Pact. It's threatening to denounce the environment agreement, the Paris Agreement, and also just signed yesterday a law denouncing the South American Treaty Organization. So we are getting out of multilateral regional fora that could solve problems in the region, and we are backing all our prestige or weight or history in case of our diplomatic corps to support very unwise and aggressive and not sounding Trump policies in Latin America. So there's all reasons for one to be worried about the Bolsonaro government and a couple of reasons to be optimistic. Historically, the ones that defended Brazil from foreign invasion or from catastrophes or from poor recession were the very people that are attacked by the economic and social policies from the elite. So I bet being in Brazil now, being back here, and seeing in the streets the way people are reacting, that are a reason to hope that the Brazilian people will overcome this really bad and dangerous situation in political, economic, and social terms. I will be more than glad to join you and try my best to clarify any points that may arise from our conversation. Thank you very much.
To speak a little bit after my two Brazilian colleagues who really follow this closely and care deeply about Brazil. It's of course their country, and they know all of the details of specific individuals and cases and policies in a way that I really could never hope to understand at the same depth. But I hope that I can make a little bit of a contribution, offering a little bit perhaps of a 1,000-foot view of what I see going on. But before I start, because I know that you all have been taking notes and listening for all this time, how many of you have been to Brazil? All right, well, I knew Doug had been to Brazil, and he doesn't get to answer the next questions, but, and how many of you know of Lula, the president that Rafael mentioned? And so we've got folks who are following Latin America and the Workers' Party that Lula led. So you have a degree of knowledge of Latin America already and of Brazil, and so I do want to kind of put the story of what we've been hearing about in Brazil in the context of Latin America and of sort of the cycles of the last 25 years or so. And the first part of making sense of that cycle, and I want to begin with sort of the period in which the Workers' Party came into power. They were elected in 2000 and in the elections in 2002, and so Lula became president, served 2 terms, and really governed in a moment of growth, of a kind of rapid growth that Brazil had never seen before. There had been other years, periods in which Brazil had grown quickly, but the period of the 2000s was a period in which Brazil grew and became more equitable. And Rafael already showed some of the statistics on that, but what we see on your right here, this is the GDP purchasing power parity. It's just going straight up in this period from 90. It's a little slower, and then it really starts to angle upwards in the 2000s. And on the left, we have Brazilian manufacturers exports, which is the blue line, and agricultural, food, raw materials, fuel, ores, and metals is the red line. You see that jump up. And so part of what this cycle, what characterizes this moment in this cycle is the rise in commodity prices. And so the way in which growth accelerated in Brazil had this underside, or had this lining, which was the price of commodities, which did explode and rose in the 2000s, and it financed much of the accelerated growth of this period. And for Brazil, a country that since the 1930s had really fought and pursued public policies and international insertion such that they could reverse this tendency, become a manufacturing exporter, and not be subject to the fluctuating prices of commodities. This switch is significant. And so we can see that even in this moment of rapid growth that Lula presided over, there was this lining and the potential for it to collapse when commodity prices collapse. But it's also the case that Lula pursued policies that made this growth equitable. And like I said, this is something that characterized Latin American and Brazilian growth during this period that had really never characterized Latin American development before. And so this was a period in which there was rapid growth and a rapid decrease in inequality and a rapid decrease in poverty. And so we have certain indicators here, social spending in the top left there. You can see the absolute value and the percent of GDP are both going up rapidly in this time, somewhat over the 1990s and then accelerating quickly in the 2000s. We can see here in the 2000s that informality and unemployment are going down. And I put the informality there because, of course, in developing countries and Brazil also, the characterization of employment is not insecure employment. It's not just if you're unemployed, but if you're employed in the informal sector and therefore not included in all the safety nets, including the kinds of things that Rafael was talking about, like Social Security and other safety nets that are attached to employment. On the bottom left here is the minimum wage and the annual increase in that minimum wage, and we can see that there was some increase in the 1990s, and it accelerates rapidly in the 2000s. And there were a number of policies that the Workers' Party put in place to really distribute the wealth that was accumulating through the rapid growth. Social spending was one of those. So increasing health and education and housing and other forms of social. Hold on one second. Yes, hold on one second. And so it was one set of one set of policies that redistributed growth. Minimum wages are really critical in Brazil and in many countries. Minimum wages are tied to all sorts of contracts. And so the contract between an employer and an employee is written in terms of minimum wages. How many minimum wages do you pay your employees? And so when the minimum wage increases, everybody's salary goes up. There's not like a renegotiation in dollar amounts for every, or in real amounts for everybody's salary. It goes automatically when each increase in the value of the minimum wage, because that's the way that wages are indexed. And other things too, so Social Security and many other benefits are written in terms of multiples of the minimum wage. So a policy that raises the minimum wage has this knock-on effect throughout the entire economy and really does have an impact. It has an impact especially on those people who are poor and below the poverty line, or close to the poverty line, and it lifts them up above it. And so this is the social change that was really represented by the kind of development that occurred in this period. That's the poor people who were well below the poverty line were lifted just above it. Their heads were just above water during this period. And that's a massive change in terms of their ability to enjoy a full citizenship. Sending their kids to school, having decent health and housing and consumption. And all of this becomes possible because they're out of that danger zone of being below the poverty line. And we'll see that this the underwriting of this. Can you get some water? Sure. Mommy's not in the room right now. Preston, can you help me get some water? Thanks. We got lots of helpers here. So the problem, of course, with a growth model that had underwriting it, at least in part, this dependence on commodity prices, is that when those commodity prices fluctuate and fall, which they do throughout history, they have, then you can have real problems. And so here's the commodity super cycle from 1998 up through 2015. And so, economists and macroeconomists talk about a super cycle of commodity prices, and this is a way of measuring sort of these patterns. And so this is an index of commodity prices. We see how it rose steadily through the 2000s. The 2008-9 financial crisis, of course, was a big drop, but then the curve really does start to tilt down after 2011, 2012. And that's going to pull the rug out from underneath the Brazilian economy and many developing countries that had come to depend on commodity exports. And here's the GDP growth rate, which fluctuates somewhat, but it's in that healthy, positive zone, and then it really starts to drop off in 2012, 13, 14, 15, and onward. And so this is that undercutting of the development model that occurs. And in some ways, what's interesting about it is that Brazil weathered the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and many emerging markets and developing countries weathered that crisis better than the North in some ways. But the crisis hit them eventually. And so whereas the fall in growth, there was a fall in 2009, but then it jumped right back up. And this is the story in many developing countries. They were able to pursue, because of the growth that had occurred in the 2000s, they were able to pursue policies that renewed growth after the crisis and to renew investment in infrastructure and jobs and the rest. But it was tenuous. And so once the knock-on effect of the crisis, which was the fall in commodity prices, occurred, then really they went straight down. And so that's really what the story is in Brazil. And the way in which Brazil, hold on one second, the way in which Brazil responded to this, of course, is here on the left, the cortes no orçamento, which is cuts in the budget. And what we see is that from one ministry to the next, and at the top is tourism, lost 63% of its budget, and work is in the middle here, 44%. The urban development ministry lost 33%. But every single ministry lost part of its budget in this year, and that's the story prior to this also in 2016, 15. The response to this crisis of growth was austerity. And this response was put in place, in fact, by the Workers' Party at first. So the president who followed Lula, his successor, Dilma, also from his party, as president governed from 2010 to 2014 and was reelected in 2014, but already before her reelection had started to put in place austerity policies to respond to this crisis that was real in terms of the economy. Austerity policies didn't work in Brazil to renew growth. And so we saw growth going farther down, and they never have. And in fact, so it was a self-inflicted wound in some ways, in the sense that the policies that they pursued, and everybody, there was a kind of consensus, oh, this will be a short-term thing, and then they put it in place, and the economy got worse. Then, in order to put in even more austerity, now they had to impeach Dilma, and this was the reason for the impeachment. In fact, it was explicitly said in these terms by some members of the incoming government. The vice president who got her impeached said, I couldn't implement more austerity without impeaching her first. She wasn't going to do it, I had to do it. And so this was the agenda, was that they had to impeach Dilma, get the Workers' Party, a left party, out of government, so they could pursue these, even more austere policies. But the economy kept on going down because that's what austerity policies do. And so, this is the sort of the political economy cycle that Brazil and that Latin America has experienced. And I do want to relate it to the rest of Latin America, but before I do, I just want to say one more thing. And Rafael has already talked a little bit about the political and social coalition and the way that has changed over time in terms of the base of the state and the base of the political parties that are represented in the state. And I think that he was exactly right in saying, what Brazil experienced in the 1990s was a turn towards neoliberalism. It was a turn towards neoliberalism in which financial sectors, middle classes, professionals, and multinational companies, and some segments of the population understood as consumers benefited. They benefited because there was this deregulation, liberalization of the economy that got inflation under control and people were purchasing again. And so this neoliberal coalition, international companies, finance, some middle-class professionals, and consumers, they were able to win elections. They won 2 consecutive elections and they were able to pursue this neoliberal agenda, but it included elements of this kind of austerity that don't produce growth. It collapsed by the end of the 1990s, the economy was stagnating, the Workers' Party came in with a response to neoliberalism. And that response to neoliberalism was a developmentalist agenda, not austerity. Lula was spending money on education, on health, on social policies, on infrastructure, like I said, promoting job growth. And this response, this neo-developmentalist response, if you want to call it that, was supported by a different social base. A social base of organized labor, of peasants in the countryside, those folks who were just below the poverty line being lifted above it, by national capital that was benefited by these infrastructure and jobs and manufacturing investment policies, by commodity exporters who were benefiting from these high prices, and Lula was happy to keep them happy. And Lula actually kept finance happy to some degree by maintaining stability, by not allowing inflation to get out of control. So we had this coalition, but it was a very unstable coalition, and once commodity prices were no longer available to hold that coalition together, to satisfy potentially contradictory demands within that coalition, it fell apart. And what brings about the impeachment, what Bolsonaro represents, is a renewed neoliberal coalition, but it's a little bit different. It's a neoliberal coalition, once again, international companies, finance, middle classes, those professionals that sort of could benefit from this opening up and deregulation and liberalization. And then instead of sort of consumers who are now responding to the ability to get past inflation, now it's evangelicals, those who are scared of crime, that sort of a demagogic base that immobilizes to win elections. But you can see how tenuous his ability to win elections is. One, we've already heard from Marco and Rafael that the political coalition itself is falling apart. Also, the basis of this coalition is they call it Bala, Biblia, and Boy. So Bala, bullets, the military, Biblia, the evangelicals, and Boy, the cattle. Is the Portuguese word for cattle, and that's the agribusiness and commodity exporters. And that coalition is holding this is the base of this government. If growth doesn't occur, and it's doubtful that it will because of the kinds of policies that they're continuing with the austerity, if they're not able to hold on to those poor urban, call them evangelical and scared of crime voters that are responding to demagogic appeals, then what's available to them is authoritarianism. And so while that neoliberal coalition of the 1990s could win some elections and didn't indicate its willingness to turn towards authoritarianism to stay in power, this coalition, I don't see much of a check on their turn towards authoritarianism. And already, with respect to certain sectors, indigenous groups, left and human rights activist groups, they're already turning towards authoritarianism. So what we have now that's different from the 1990s is an authoritarian version of neoliberalism. And so that's the context in Brazil. That's what Bolsonaro represents. It is part of this cyclical process that is macroeconomic and it's political, but it's a very dangerous moment for Brazil. And if we go to the next slide, we can see it's also part of a very dangerous turn in all of Latin America. And so if we look at Latin America from 1998 till 2018, there were 34 elections in 16 countries, and the left won a lot of them. There were left victories in all of these countries. I've left in bold the countries where the left remains in power. Honduras and Costa Rica I put in parentheses because it's all relative. The left's that were there were not the same kind of left that we might find everywhere, but in other places. But they were elections won by people running against neoliberalism, right? People putting out a campaign, a platform against neoliberalism. But since 2014, only one new country has seen a left party win, and that's a new country, and that's Mexico in 2018. We've seen some countries where the right remains dominant throughout. Colombia, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Panama. And we've also seen places in which the right comes to power after the left had won an election. The right wins an election in Chile, Argentina, and Peru, Salvador, Honduras, Brazil, Haiti. But we also see the willingness of the right, and in some cases of the left, to come to power with non-electoral means. Coups in Haiti, Honduras, Paraguay, and Brazil. Flawed elections in Haiti, Honduras, multiple times, Brazil. The flawed elections, I think, in Venezuela, you can point to some of the elections there as flawed. Cuba, I don't know how to characterize the kind of elections there. Attempted coups in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, multiple times in Venezuela and Bolivia. And so we see this turn away from democratic mechanisms of legitimating the state, of building a social coalition that is legitimated through an election and then that governs. And so the willingness to move away from these sort of democratic and electoral mechanisms is dangerous. It is a trend in the region. It is related to this response to the left turn. The fact that the left was winning these elections over this period, the right was willing to move away from electoral democracy, and we see that across the region. There have been a couple of presidents who fell for corruption allegations in Peru and Guatemala, and these are two countries in which the party system is so messed up you don't really have a left and a right, and so we don't see the same sort of cyclical patterns and responses, but still it's a move away from the notion that we legitimate and constitute governments through electoral means. So just to end, this pattern of a movement away from electoral democracy is a problem in Latin America, and it's a problem around the world. This move away from what we understand to be democratic processes. I do think it's worth reminding ourselves of the larger macroeconomic and political economic cycle and the moment that we're in that cycle. And so we talked a little bit about how commodity prices and their cyclical behavior interacted with this political process in Brazil. But globally, what I think we see is this crisis of capitalism. And that crisis of capitalism was signaled by the 2008-2009 crisis, and we haven't figured it out. We have not figured out within capitalism, how do you renew growth? How do you renew growth in electoral democracies, electoral processes? And in fact, what we're seeing is that the way in which countries think that they can renew growth is by greater extraction, mine more, chop down more trees, destroy the environment more, greater exploitation, so strict labor rights, repress workers and workers' movements more, and engage in more imperial policies, breaking down the barriers to accumulation and profit for national companies as they operate in smaller and weaker countries around the world. And so it's this turn towards extraction and exploitation and empire, which capital appears to have decided is the only way in which it can renew itself. It can renew growth. Well, democracies don't like extraction, exploitation, and empire. And so this is where the link to the turn away from democracy comes into this story. And that's part of what's happening in Brazil, it's part of what's happening around the world. And so I think that we can put sort of the day-to-day politics and individuals and forces that we heard about in Brazil in this larger context to understand more of what's going on. So on that depressing note, I'm going to end and open up to comments and questions and suggestions and critiques. So thank you very much.
How much could you turn the country around to this sort of right-wing economic, political regression within 100 days. So it makes me think that they're just setting the groundwork for people to revolt. And the thought that came to mind as all three of you were speaking was pitchforks and torches. You know,
Maybe
I'm a pacifist, but goodness, this is just.
How about you want to say something about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's sad enough when you realize that hoping for pitch and forks might actually be an optimistic scenario, right? Which I think is the case. I'm sorry, I'm a little more pessimistic than that. I do think in a technical sense, yes, is a mile wide and an inch deep in the sense that the government is more dysfunctional and quite honestly incompetent, right? Then they themselves believe that the electorate believe they would be able to really push for these things.
Right, because they
But in a more societal sense, I think the Brazilian society has embarked in the last few years onto a much more conservative project, which Bolsonaro has become the conduit, the recent conduit for that, and the means to bring it to power. But I think if Bolsonaro were to die, he's mid-70s, whatever, I don't know how healthy life he has, that's or whatever, but if he were to die or be impeached or renounce or resign, I'm not sure that movement, that sort of political group and vision would not continue on its own, right? So in a way, Bolsonaro is an expression of a bigger problem, right? So that's why I'm deeply concerned about this conservative trend, and conservative I mean not first and foremost of this notion of we are a deeply unequal society, and among the ruling elites, cultural, political, and economic, and proud of being so. Right? We no longer have that sense that we want to work on this. We want to do better than this, right? I grew up in a country, Brazil, coming out of dictatorship when most of the people share the view that okay, we may disagree on the way to get there. That's why we have center-left and center-right parties. But we all want to do better. We all believe that poverty is a problem that needs to be addressed. We may disagree on the means, but we no longer is the case now. We see that, and that also has expressions in the sense of criminals ask for it and they need to be killed without trial, that kind of thing. That may not persist. That may be some sort of nightmarish scenario that people embark and they may waken up at some point, if violence really happens. Because yes, I think that we could count on that because we have a little bit of historical precedent where people have come up to the senses, not in an ideal sense, but to prevent the worst outcome of a civil war, let's say. Right? We haven't seen that. Brazil has seen enough violence throughout its history, but not in an open scale civil war and that massive scale as some of its neighbors have seen. But I'm pessimistic in the sense to say I think this is a process that I don't know how soon we're going to be able to come out of it, in the sense to regain sense of a collective project, a sense of we should rebuild an idea of working to promote a more inclusive society. We're no longer there. We're no longer there. We were there for the last 30 years until recently. Of course, a lot of people disagree with that view, but as a mainstream, right, we think we were there, and we're no longer there. That's my fear. We'll see.
Thank you.
Yep. See, 1, 2, should we go ahead, please?
Okay, I just want to check something. I thought I heard one of the speakers say that the owner of a mega church on Colorado Boulevard now owns the media in Brazil.
It's this Pentecostal church called Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. And they had a branch on Colorado Boulevard, and right on that square, Colorado and Alameda there, it's a church that used to be a different church, and they bought it, and they tried it out, and they closed it off. It's no longer there. They used to have a sign there. I don't know how it didn't go very far.
They own some media in Brazil?
Well, so in this church, right, they own the second most rated ratings TV channel in Brazil.
This is sounding very familiar to our country. So that's one thing, and the other question I had is, did I hear you say there's some dynamic between the manufacturing sector and the commodities sector? The commodities was a big factor in what you said, but I don't understand why manufacturing apparently was going down. Could you elaborate?
Sure. So, I mean, manufacturing went down in Brazil starting in the 1990s and then really, and continued. And it was, manufacturing in Brazil depended on a regulatory regime and state involvement that the government in the 1990s got away from. They gave up on a national development bank that would invest in the innovative sectors that could keep Brazilian manufacturing competitive, the protective trade and other sorts of policies and subsidies that would allow Brazilian manufacturing to remain competitive and export internationally. And so once they gave up on those policies, then Brazilian manufacturing really started to decline and lost space in the economy to other sectors like commodities, as I indicated, and to other competitors internationally who were investing and putting in the policy that would allow their manufacturing sectors to excel. So Brazil gave up on its manufacturing sector in the 1990s, and while Lula put in, and the Workers' Party put in a lot of neo-developmentalist policies as far as pumping money into the economy, they weren't able to turn around manufacturing. Dilma tried to some degree, but in fact, it was too late. So when Dilma, after her government started in 2010, started to put in some policies like some tax incentives for manufacturing and other sorts of incentives, hoping that manufacturers would invest and start to rebuild that sector, they'd already given up on it. They'd already turned away from her government, and so they didn't respond in the way that she expected. And in fact, they backed the same push for impeachment that the financial sectors and others had asked for. I saw it in here, and then Doug, did you? I'm sorry, Margaret, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just add that there was the exchange rate factor as well, but one thing that very concrete in terms of abandoning and denouncing the South American treaty and the Latin American policy is that we are losing the very markets that were absorbing industrial exportation from Brazil, and there's also the competition arena and the trade wars from the Trump government. So there's a combination of factors, but mainly I agree with Aaron, and would like just to add these other factors. And there's a big concern about the significance of losing South America right now.
Good point. Thanks, yeah.
Referring to your recent comment, it sounded like you were referring to a degree, a cyclical arrangement between the solidification of power and development. Is there any reason that we have to believe that it's cyclical? I mean, it looks like we have periods during which we have an expansion of civil rights, an expansion of compassion. We have economic advantages becoming more broadly distributed, but those periods seem to be few and sporadic, and then they're put down by much more powerful, solidified economic and political interests. Am I way off base there?
I mean, this is what we're going through now. So it makes sense of it is hard for all of us, right? And just to narrow on the Brazilian, I think there are echoes of what's happening here and happening globally. Yes. I mean, maybe the social democratic and the abundance of the 60s and 70s in European social democracies and the welfare state in this country are come to an end, and we may not see a revival any time soon, or maybe not, and I hope I'm wrong, and I apologize in advance for sounding a little too pessimistic, but That's what I am now, and just to focus on the Brazilian case specifically. I'm part of a generation, people, maybe 10, 15 years even older than me, and maybe even 10 years younger than me. So this generation that comes of age in the last quarter of the 20th century, that look back into the trajectory of Brazilian society, a deeply unequal, right, and authoritarian society. But coming to finally, right, to a moment when things seem to be starting to do a little better. And I'll be very, moderate on that, a little better. But we assumed, right, democracy was consolidated in the last 30 years in Brazil. And then we now agree on the social pact notions of, again, we may disagree on the means, and there will be, different governments in power, but they're all going to try to address, the deep inequality, or at least the absolute poverty, right? We're not aiming at any sort of, vibrant social democracy, but at least let's try to ameliorate, absolute poverty. Brazil is undergoing a new phase in that process now. That's as far as we know. How long is this new phase going to last? No one knows, of course. I'm afraid, however, that though it may, and I hope for it not, being the new normal for a long, period of time, that we see a emergence of the underpinnings of a deeply authoritarian society that was reflected in the political regimes, but that was there, right? There's deep structural reasons for why it was always there and why it was so hard to be more democratic. And so it's almost as if to say that what my generation witnessed is the exception rather than the culmination of a process that was finally coming to fruition. But I don't know. We'll see. But again, I wanted, to agree with Marco, even though we have, exchanged ideas on this before, that, there's a vibrancy of a mobilization of Brazilian civil society and social movements that, against all odds, have always been present, and that, especially in the last 40 years, part of my generation, have played a decisive role. And I, give credit to them historically, and I hope they'll once again be able to, do their share.
I know Doug had his hand up earlier, and then sorry.
Yeah, I don't want to word this, but to go back to the earlier issue of the graph that you showed, as I understood it, was the value of agriculture, mining, oil and gas, and other extractive resource exports.
Yeah.
And the manufacturing line on the graph was also exports. It wasn't necessarily manufacturing value as a percentage of gross domestic product, but rather the decline in export of manufactured goods, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So the follow-up question to that is, to what degree did the increases in minimum wage and other benefits to the working class and the poor result in increased consumption domestically of manufacturers that otherwise would have been exported? And related to that, to what degree was the decline in exports of manufactured goods the result of the increased price of those goods on an international market, when that price includes precisely those minimum wages and increased wages in the manufacturing centers that are the most organized in terms of organized labor?
That's both of those factors in play, and it's definitely the case that in the 2008-9 downturn, Lula planned and counted on increased manufacturing production for domestic consumption to be part of Brazilian renewed growth. And so that was a moment at which he attempted to, in fact, make that sort of dynamic occur, and there were a couple of policies specifically that sought to do that around promoting the purchase of consumer durables like refrigerators and cars, and so a new loan program to allow people to access those kinds of goods. many of which would be produced in Brazil, and then an infrastructure program around housing that was going to be targeted at mass consumption that would produce at a different time, but related kind of manufacturing. And so there was the hope that domestic consumption could be a driver for growth in a way that it hadn't been prior. So in fact, much of the growth, what drove growth was the external sector, and so dependence on commodities was central to that. Lula tried to shift away from that. I'd say that part of the recovery was, could be explained by that, but ultimately it wasn't able to resist when the external sector collapsed. As for what was the second?
Well, the minimum wage, in terms of exports.
Yeah. So, so there have been studies that attempt to say, well, why do Brazilian exports, like manufacturing exports, get out-competed by the production from China or some other place that has incredibly low wages? And people do point to the wage costs and the social benefits that are attached to the wage. But it's also the case that Brazilian manufacturing had reached a level of technological achievement that they shouldn't have been competing just on the basis of price, right? I mean, they're able to make the Embraer airplanes, which are the cutting edge of technological sophistication and international competitiveness, and so they shouldn't have had to only depend on price as the key. But you're right, it would have taken serious investment in innovation capacity and research and other things to allow your manufacturing exports to move into those new sectors, and they gave up on that.
Yeah, why bother investing in those goods when you can grab land from the indigenous for, quote, free, and at virtually low cost, and then export at a high price. So I think your colleague has a comment.
Yeah, Mark, yeah.
And just there's another factor, it's the deep dependence of the financial sector. You make a lot more money in Brazil by investing in public funds and in bonds and stocks and all financial sector than investing in production. So there is a commodity attraction, but also a financial sector dependence. And this is a big distortion in our economy because we run the highest interest rates in the world now.
Yeah. Sorry, you had an observation.
How much an impact do you think came from global capitalist markets and neoliberal power have on this drastic change on Brazil? We talk about it like it's all these details for what Brazil's going through, but like that happened before. Well, I don't know, for a big reason, a horrible reason.
Again,
And not just Brazil.
to measure that, of course, is the task that we're going to be engaged with for the years to come, right? Especially political scientists. If we ever are able to do that. But of course, I think we already can say, pretty safely that, of course, Brazil doesn't exist in a void, and it's immersed into a regional, hemispheric, and global context. I'll just put some meat into that and say the following: that I think yes. I mean, first, the Brazilian economy, as Aaron very well described, in the sense, the halting of the possibility to continue on that path of a sort of a social pact, and towards more economic inclusion, and that requires some adjustment, of course. But why the neoliberal is the fix, right? That gain momentum. I think that's where we can really situate things in a more regional context. Again, I mean, the neoliberal policy, the neoliberal agenda is the one that has more traction in the media. Let's be very honest. This was the case in the 80s. This was the case again in the last several years in Brazil. So you were hammered every single day. I spent most of my summers in Brazil for the last 10 years. And while I teach here, doing the academic here, and it's just amazing. It's just sort of, maddening how, all the TV channels and radio and newspapers were hammering all that thing. And now they're still doing it. When they call this reforms that Bolsonaro is pushing Congress the way they presented every single day on the night news and throughout the day, it's like the reforms that Brazil needs, the reforms that Brazil requires. And so that's how things are phrased. So of course that is what, and in doing so, they led voice to the ideologues and to the financial sector advisors and analysts that are, study here in the United States, in Chicago schools and others, and that have connections with Wall Street, and we measure what really is the means of proof success in Brazil is the stock rate, the stock market, and compared to Wall Street, not real jobs and employment. The stock market in Brazil is doing really well. It's doing very well for the last several years. It was doing not very well until up to 2-3 years ago. Now it's doing records highs, but as Marco said, the numbers of unemployment are falling. So that's part of it. And then just to kind of talk about the glue that sort of make the oil that led the engine of Bolsonaro's broad coalition, weird coalition to come to power. It came to a point when a lot of people were saying, well, I'm going to vote for Bolsonaro because he's going to be our Trump. He's the Trump of the tropics. What we need is this kind of guy. The guy who speaks his mind. This macho figure, and this guy who's from the outside. Of course, he couldn't fit on the idea of a business guy because Bolsonaro is not a business guy. But the outsider, the guy who speaks his mind, the guy who's going to come to shake things up. So I think we don't know. And then there are other things to talk about the investigations of corruption. That some of those judges had connections to the FBI and training, but that's sort of the part that we still, some people have voiced in different ways, but at least even without going into that direction of sort of a role of the United States government overt in the process, in the sense of the environment of the revival of the neoliberal agenda, and the environment of the sort of anti-establishment narrative, gaining momentum in the political narratives in the world, that certainly played a role in Brazil being one new phase of one country to witness that more recently.
Marco, did you want to say anything on that?
Yes, just another final thought. To defend democracy in Brazil, I think it's highly dependent on defending democracy in the United States. Brazil is not a small political country. It's 8th or 9th biggest economy in the world, 200 million people. And one lesson from the Brazilian history and what's new in Brazil is that as the highest inequality means the lowest chance of democracy to consolidate. And it brings all the bad in people in terms of being predatory to the institutions and to the other people, the weak in the society. So, of course, the United States has a stronger institution, democratic institution than Brazil. But the systematic attack from the richest and the technocrats, especially the budget that is being proposed to 2020 in the United States, shows that being the most unequal rich country in the world, the United States is not safe from the risks that Brazil is facing. I think that should be a thought for all people that are concerned with justice and democracy in the United States, that look carefully. Brazil was prey to that solution. Also, it's growing in Europe and other parts, and we need to really think hard about the consequence of such unequal societies in terms of innovation, social development, economic development, environmental sustainability, and democracy in the future.
Jim, did you where's your question?
I did, but it was sort of weird.
You're like weird. Well, anyway, I really want to thank everybody. I thank DJPC, Rafael, our good friend Marco Sapicki. You can look him up online. He's got a long CV and lots of publications. Anyway, it's great to do these events. We always get participation from Sol and Luna, which is always nice too. Rebecca, did you want to say anything?
Well, they're in close, and I want to especially thank Marco, who was available to speak to us from Brazil. Given that he's there, he just returned, could give us the current perspective. And this is something that I've been trying to do at DJPC, is bringing the voices of people that are there, that can give you the real knowledge of what is going on. So that is one of the important things for us. Yes, and and also with these forums, what we try to do is also try to bring ideas of how to resist, or what to do in terms of what can we do here in the U.S. to support the struggles that people are having in Latin America. They seem to be the same across the continent, because I don't think it's only happening over there, it's also happening over here, as you were mentioning. So it's very important to keep watching for those links and keep understanding that it's our struggles that are going to help the movement.